Hi everyone, welcome back to Real Talk, our campus weekly video series where we discuss relationships, empathy, advocacy, and life. All of our episodes are pre-recorded and released every Tuesday at 5 p.m. on our IGTV and Facebook. And today we have another guest speaker. We're so excited. So I want to welcome Melissa, and I'll introduce her in a moment. And the reason we have Melissa with us today is we're going to be discussing human trafficking. Since January is Human Trafficking Awareness Month, we thought it would be obviously fit to talk about this issue before January ended in a more, in this setting during Real Talk, in addition to our social media posts and things if you might have been following there. So Melissa is a fellow colleague, used to work at the Women's Center full-time, but is still affiliated with the Women's Center and has worn many hats within the Women's Center and everything too. So has a lot of expertise and knowledge about human trafficking. So we're really excited to have you. So thanks for being here. And did you want to share any kind of information background about, your roles and everything like that?
Yeah, so I used to work for the Women's Center full-time, and I was the child counselor advocate, but then took on the role of also being campus counselor advocate, then went to just being full-time child counselor advocate. I also started doing forensic interviewing through a local multidisciplinary team, which I don't know if you guys have talked about that here or not.
Nope.
But I interview children who have disclosed some form of abuse. So I do that, and I still continue working as a trauma therapist. So I'm a licensed mental health counselor, and I'm just happy to be here and so happy to be interacting with you two and sharing this discussion with, the campus and everything, and just for the social media. I think it's a great opportunity.
I know. It's nice, like we were saying in other episodes too, it's been a fun way to reconnect with some colleagues and things to have this series. So it's exciting. And I think this topic is so often, I wouldn't say overlooked, it's just ignored. Like people just don't want to talk about human trafficking. It's too daunting. It's too dark and heavy. Or they just have total misconceptions about the issue and don't think they need to talk about it because, it doesn't happen here, or, that wouldn't happen to anyone I know. When in reality, it's way more prevalent, I think, than people realize. And I mean, especially I think I thought about as you were kind of giving your bio too, you have so many different types of therapies that you provide, even I was thinking about the SANS therapy and just all the different things that you've done with kids. I'm sure that a lot comes out, and obviously we're talking to the college population today, but just all the different ways to bring out the conversation about these issues, because it's so hard for victims to talk about, let alone our community, right? It's just a weird thing to bring out.
And I think, even kind of like I'm just thinking that oftentimes, I mean, I don't know if you guys have been in sessions where a client has been sharing something and then they realize, or we realize, oh, it sounds like this is actually something to do with human trafficking, or it sounds like they've been trafficked. And, part of our jobs as advocates or therapists is to try to give a name to their experience, even though we don't want to necessarily identify this is what happened to you, but providing that education.
Right.
And, that moment where they're like, oh, that's what that was. Okay. And then there's that connection and that oh, you're seeing me, you're hearing me.
Yeah.
And again, when it comes to human trafficking, it's one of those things where it's you think of the movie Taken. It's someone snatched up, you're in Europe, you're getting drugged, all those things are chained up, when in reality, it could be anyday people just walking around. And, they're free to go about their business, but then, they go to school, they go to work, whatever, and then they have to go and live this whole other, or be forced to live this whole other experience, and kind of go under the radar or so many different things. Also, we forgot to mention in the beginning, for the viewers, my cat is here. You may see her. So she's perched up over there for a moment, but
she's gonna just pounce in.
She will come right across the screen. Yeah, so if if you see her, she's sometimes calming, sometimes not.
Maybe this topic will get her all agitated. Like she's just like, I'm ready, let's talk about it. Like,
that's why she comes to meetings. That's why she comes to my sessions, because she's really involved in the process. So
she cares so much about human trafficking.
Invested.
I love though, maybe that's where we can start too with the conversation that you brought up of just the misconception that people think like victims are just free, like, or not free to go, that they assume that they have to be kidnapped and trapped and like held against their will.
Living in chains.
Reality is, or chained up or something. Or I've even heard the cases in the media that are like the extreme cases where people are like literally locked away, right? Or, held in containment and things like that. But the reality is they are free to move about, like you were explaining, right? But that it doesn't mean, just like in an abusive relationship, it doesn't mean that they can just leave or, get out of that situation very easily. And I think particularly for folks like we're talking about, kind of the adult population, not even keeping in mind what it's like for children to have to deal with that kind of double life feeling. But there's so many barriers for people to leave those types of situations. And so maybe that's where we can start, like, what are some of those barriers and things that prevent people from being able to get out of a trafficking situation?
Yeah. Well, like you're saying too, it's very much, the dynamics of domestic violence, and those dynamics go hand in hand with human trafficking,
right?
Where, they get involved with this person, maybe they meet them, in person, maybe they meet them on campus, maybe it's a boss, maybe it's supposed friend or supposed partner. Yeah. And then it's like, you start with the grooming process where, they get to know you, maybe they like to wine and dine you or expose you to a whole other world, and just, be very charming, like many abusers are, and then slowly start to infiltrate, like, oh, maybe they're showing off that they have money that in reality that trafficking victim will not access or get, like, very few amount of that good. Or it's something along the lines of people who have to couch surf and, survival sex where, okay, well, you can stay at my place. However, you have to give me something in return,
right.
Which I think also is a whole misconception in terms of what trafficking is.
Yeah.
I actually have a funny story. I was doing a training the other day, or I was attending a training, and they had us doing this activity where it's a story. It was supposed to get people talking and understand their biases and blah, blah, blah. But the whole thing was like you had to rank the people who you like least liked to the most liked person. And the situation, one of the situations in the story is that there's a sailor, again, to a wreck. And basically this girl wants to get her fiance who ends up on this other island, right? And there's a whole story. But in the story though, the sailor's like, cool, I can fix the boat and get you to your fiance, but you have to sleep with me in order for me to do this. And instantaneously, I can't go into the whole, like, I'm not going to tell you the whole story, but the sailor was my least favorite person.
Yeah.
And I was like, and even in the training, I was like, hi, everybody, welcome to Human Trafficking Month.
Right.
And I'm just like, here's this person who could easily just, if they have the skill to fix this boat, because it's not going to just benefit the girl and the fiance in the situation, it's also going to benefit everyone for their survival. But they're like, okay, you have to exchange with me for this thing in order for me to, which is, force of, coercion and all those things that are involved in trafficking. And I was like, oh, this is like, of course, this is. And
you're like,
there she goes, and she only hit the mute button. Sometimes she'll walk on the
end call.
Oh yeah, she ruins things all the time, but we love her.
That's so. That's so interesting, because that was one of the things, Cara, when you first said, like, what are some barriers to leaving, like, a trafficking situation? The first thing that came to my mind, other than, like, access to resources, is also this idea of, like, I don't know, we talk about it all the time with domestic violence. When somebody asks for help, people often hear, well, you don't have bruises, or you don't have this, you don't have that, you know, so what do you mean? What's going on? Like, and they don't necessarily believe it if it's not that, like, movie type of, like, domestic violence or whatever. It's so much harder too to even identify, like, trafficking. For the victim to identify that, oh my gosh, this is what's happening first, and then to have the courage to come out and say, hey, I'm stuck in this really, like, scary, tricky, uncomfortable or situation at, like, the very least, right? And have somebody believe them to then want to help them, like, if it's not this high intense level like you would see in Taken or you know, any of those other kind of settings.
Yeah. And there's so many layers to it too, that, like, there's a lot of the kind of history of trauma in that person's life that will play a role in how the victim will view their own experience. So a lot of times they don't want help. Like, they're not the type of person who is going to seek out assistance. A lot of times it's either they're at their wit's end and they have no other options, or it's that light bulb of, like, finally, whatever, coming to realize this isn't healthy, this isn't okay, what's happening to me. But a lot of times they're resistant to, you know, help, and they want to believe that they were the ones in control. They want to believe that they were the ones making their own decisions, but being taken advantage of, like, from start to finish, you know, with their trafficker. But I was thinking too, as you're both saying those things about, like, particularly with college students, of the notion of owing sex or any type of sexual activity is something I hear all the time. And this is for anyone of any identity, but that was another piece that I was thinking of, the barrier for a lot of, like, LGBTQ folks.
Yeah.
Being homeless or not having a place to stay, like when you're talking about the couch surfing and stuff like that. But there's such a notion of, I did something nice for you, so you have to give me something in return, even as, like, small as someone going on a date with somebody and they paid for dinner, and then they are thinking, oh, well, they paid for dinner, so I guess I should sleep with them, or I guess I should kiss them if they kiss me, or whatever, even if they're not interested in doing that. And that's, I feel like, is such a huge part of the messaging that, you know, which is why, like, exploitation is just not part of the conversation. They don't even consider, or survival sex, or whatever that looks like. It's such a big problem, particularly I feel like with the college population. I see that a lot.
I think there was, Melissa, when you mentioned it earlier, of, like, working with clients who explain that experience and we have to help them, like, label, like, maybe this was trafficking. I think a lot of times, with whether it's people who have experienced it themselves or it's the general population just talking about it, people are talking about trafficking without even realize they're talking about it. With the, you know, the sailboat example, you know, people use the word, like, pimp all the time. I was listening to a podcast one time, one of, like, my favorite podcasts, and they had someone on and they were talking about how this, I'm going to use words that, like, we wouldn't use, but, like, how this, like, hooker was fighting with her pimp on the street corner, and, like, oh God, we just have to pretend it's not happening. And I had to, like, immediately turn it off. I was like, you guys you're talking about trafficking, and you mean a victim is fighting with her trafficker. And, like, I understand that not everybody maybe has all that knowledge, but I think it's so not talked about directly, but people sometimes are talking about it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And I think too, well, there's so many points that
you're, like, listing them in your head, like, what are we going, where to go next?
Different directions we can go. But yeah, I think, you know, going back to, like, this misconception, of course, you know, I was talking about, you know, I let my partner know when all the awareness days are coming up and we talk about different things, and it really, like, blew their mind when they were just, I don't know, they made a comment, and then I was like, well, no, it could be literally anyone. Like, you know, there's this dynamic of, oh, it has to be a pimp, and then it's like a hooker or a prostitute or whatever. And I'm like, it could easily be, you know, if it was like a younger child, it could be their nanny, it could be like a coach,
Right.
or if people that are in high school or young adults, where it could be a friend, where, it's like, okay, we really want you, we want to go to the party, and maybe they're underage, but they want to score drugs or alcohol to go to the party or whatever. And then it's like, okay, well, just do X, Y, and Z with this person so you can get that good. And all, like, but it's like, okay, there's not a money exchange, but there's that exchange for good.
Right.
And, going back to like, the survival sex and like couch surfing and things like that, where it's like, okay, there isn't like that direct money exchange, which is so like, used when it comes to, prostitution or whatever. But in reality, it's like, okay, even if there's not that money exchange, there's still an exchange for some type of good. And oftentimes when someone's being trafficked, okay, maybe a good's being exchanged or money's being exchanged or whatever, doesn't necessarily mean that person who is then being forced into this situation is getting any of those things in return.
Right. Yeah. As you were saying, like all the different directions we can go, I don't know why my brain immediately went to what traffickers target in people. Because I think it's important too for people to recognize that like the reason we keep emphasizing that it can happen to anyone by anyone is because I think a lot of people assume that it's either like people traveling to the United States and they don't speak English, or they're not connected to family here, so it's like easier to take advantage of someone who's kind of immigrating to the United States or whatever that might look like. That absolutely does happen, right? And that is something that we see, particularly with like labor trafficking and stuff like that too. But yeah, it can happen to anyone of any background, and that traffickers will seek out what makes somebody vulnerable, and they know how to offer that to someone. And I love before how you mentioned too of like the trafficker can be anyone. I think we have this image of the like Halloween costume of a pimp, like of that's what it looks like. When in reality, like you said, it can be anyone walking around, but especially they will pose as a romantic partner. And so they will engage in that grooming process you were talking about and use that to trap that person into trafficking. But thinking about what makes people vulnerable is, I mean, anything. Like, I think that's important to maybe for us to dive into a little deeper too, of like, obviously for marginalized communities, like people of color, the LGBTQ plus community, like people with disabilities, there's people of all different backgrounds, but that have needs that are not being met in lots of different ways. So
I'm thinking since in that like lens of the conversation, and with this idea of like, right, we're talking to college students and how this might pop up. When everything went remote in March, everything shut down, everybody had to move out of the residence halls. Being on campus, I was like, I could name a ton of students that this is their only access to housing is the residence.
Right. Yeah.
Where are they going? What's happening? And then the schools everywhere did so much good to plan for when we reopen in the fall. And then if we close, or we're going to close at Thanksgiving, we're going to close early. I think like every single school did this across the country. And I remember being like, okay, so what happens to the person who this is all they've got until December or May, whenever, whatever semester we're in. So that, that's another vulnerability too, right? If we're talking about like survival sex or the exchanging of goods, like people who are desperate, they have to go somewhere, and the pandemic has brought up so many different things for so many different reasons and so many different scenarios. And totally. I can only imagine, who ran into that as an issue along with what we're talking about now.
Yeah, I feel like that's huge.
Yeah. It is. I mean, even from working on campus, we know that there are certain protocols and things set up for students that, are in tough situations and aren't able to afford housing, where occasionally they'll help out in some way if they qualify. But then, even with homeless shelters and things like that, it's like, okay, well, where am I going to go? Am I going to go put myself in a homeless shelter where there's like that resource, but also taking into consideration COVID,
right,
exposed to all these other people, And is it safer for me to go to a place where maybe it's just a few people I know that are my friends, quote unquote?
Mhm.
Right. Yeah.
Right. And if it's a desperate thing of like, I have to figure this out because I need access to the internet so I can finish my finals, or, you know, whatever it is. And this is how I'm going to get it. Like, people aren't automatically assigning, you know, that experience as trafficking or exploitation, but it really is, you know, what's happening.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I remember seeing something you guys posted about human trafficking, and I'm pretty sure with like housing and things like that and vulnerabilities on the social media. Go
Mm.
check it out. I think it was a great resource. And I was like, oh my God, yeah, because especially with everything going on with the pandemic, I mean, obviously there's been a lot of, well, maybe not a lot, but there have been resources and, you know, the executive orders have been set in place so that, you know, folks aren't being evicted because they've lost their jobs and they can't afford things. But then there are certain situations where, you know, a landlord will take advantage of that situation where it's like, okay, well, if you can't afford, you know, your rent, then let's figure out another way of
Mm-hmm.
getting payment. Which then, you know, again, leads into a human trafficking type of situation, because, you know, and that might be like, okay, well, maybe we did this one time and you know, I had to do it for survival, but then the slippery slope of that landlord taking advantage of that, it's like, okay, well, I was able to do it once, let's see how much I can take advantage of this person even more.
Yeah.
um,
Right.
or, you know, being like, okay, well, if you don't do this, then I'm gonna raise the rent, or once the eviction process does start, then I'm going to definitely evict you. But if you do this, then maybe I'll be more lenient or something like that.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. It's just taking advantage of people in their times of need or just in their times of vulnerability, like whatever that may look like, whether it's low self-esteem, right, going through a hard time in their life and someone takes advantage of that, or a basic need that's not being met and they're taking advantage of that situation. And I had a thought and it totally just fell out of my head. Well, I was thinking about the grooming process that you were talking about. And I think that's important to explain too a little of like what that can look like of like, let's say a college student. I always give the example of like, you know, let's say 19 years old, you know, came out to their parents as, let's say, gay, and their parents don't accept their identity and kick them out of the house. They now need a place to stay. They meet someone, or maybe they've already started maybe dating this person, who knows. And just as you were saying before, of like, it doesn't happen sometimes overnight, where all of a sudden this person is like, you're going to have sex with this person for money and I'm going to take it from you. It starts, or it can start as like, you know, yeah, you can move in with me, but you're going to have to help chip in the rent. Oh no, my car broke down. Look, I've always taken care of you. Now you have to take care of me. Maybe you can go strip for a couple of nights and make up that money. But then all of a sudden it snowballs into like what you were saying of like, I got you that one time, you know, I can get you again kind of thing. And people don't even realize that they're in that situation at all. Like we were saying earlier, what would you say, like, either maybe suggestions, recommendations, whatever, for people who might notice these behaviors? Maybe they're listening to this video and they're like, oh my gosh, that's something I've been through. That's something that happened to me. Or like, that sounds really familiar. I think maybe my friend or my family member is going through that. What would you say to those people who are kind of having that moment of like, oh, that's what that was?
Yeah. Well, I think first and foremost, like just being there for that person in that realization, because that's shocking, you know, just like, oh my God, like what has happened, which then can bring on a lot of shame and guilt, especially because a lot of traffickers were like, well, you wanted to do this, like, and really putting like in that grooming process where they're really putting the onus on the victim, like, oh, you chose to do this, or you were willing to do this, when really they're forced to do it because of, you know, all their vulnerabilities or other
over time and over like, you know, excuse after excuse and whatever it might be.
Right.
Exactly. And I think, you know, always direct them towards the women's center, you know, and noting that, like, you know, there are different resources, especially if there's again, another thing traffickers might do is like, okay, well, there are no other options, especially during the pandemic. There's no other options, which resources, are unfortunately limited. But, I think it's always good to look for resources and to try to figure out, okay, what options are there? Because I think that's another factor that gets, a lot of people down, is that feeling of hopelessness and helplessness, and feeling like there are no options. There's been plenty of times when people would come into the Women's Center and, they're like, this is the situation with my abuser, blah, blah, blah. And they are like, there's no options. I'm just stuck here. And then, you go to a professional and you're able to say, okay, I'm hearing that you're having issues with housing. Let's look into this. I hear you're having issues with getting food supplies. Let's look at these resources. Going through victim compensation, if that's an option. There's just so many different options, and, not everyone's going to qualify for everything. But if you don't know, then you don't know.
Yeah.
And you don't know until you ask. That's a very big proponent to that saying.
Sure.
And, just understanding that this is something that can happen to anyone. And I think I run a domestic violence support group, and even a lot of my clients, it's like, how did I get here? And again, going back to that shame and that guilt, and understanding that this can happen to anyone. Unfortunately, we all have jobs because this stuff is happening.
Right.
And I wish I didn't have a job because of this stuff. And just for people to know that, it's like, oh, wow, there's not just one, organization. There's multiple organizations that are trying to combat and support people. And the support is there and the options are there. It's just, trying to get over that hurdle, and knowing that, people are worth saving. People are worth a second chance, or a third chance, or a fourth chance, or, how many chances it can be. Because even when it comes to domestic violence and human trafficking, for domestic violence, we know that it takes, sometimes the average time to leave that abusive relationship is 7 times. And in human trafficking, that can be very similar. So I'm just like thinking all of the documentaries that I've watched, or movies I've watched, related to human trafficking, even though they don't note it, that they note it as prostituting, but it's human trafficking. Right. And that at times that person goes back to that situation, or feels like, I don't have any option. So they're either pulled back for different reasons, or it's just not safe to leave. Because just like domestic violence, leaving is the most dangerous part. Human trafficking, that's a dangerous game to play as well, because it's like, okay, if someone's a drug dealer or someone's a gun dealer, but it's like, that's a good where, if you're dealing drugs, you can only deal drugs once and then the transaction's done. But if you're taking this person who the trafficker views the product, and you're trying to get away or take that profit away, there's going to be an issue, because now you're messing with my business, you're messing with my money, blah, blah, blah. If we're going to like that span of like kind of a more, I wouldn't even say that's a high end thing, but there's like, okay, that power and control dynamic is being disrupted. And it's like, oh, you're trying to get out of this? Well, I'm going to show you who's in control.
Yeah. That helplessness is so huge too, because I feel like, particularly with what it leaves a victim with, like a lot of times victims of trafficking will sometimes commit other crimes during their time of being trafficked. Maybe they're drug related crimes, maybe they're theft and things, whatever it may be, related to, or because of their victimization, right, and their trauma and things like that. But then now they have a record, or maybe they get arrested for prostitution, even though it wasn't prostitution. And so now they have that on their record, and it's harder for them then, whenever they may or can leave that situation, then they may not have access to other jobs because they have now a criminal record, or they may not feel like they have, like you said, all those other resources and things, places to go. And I just, what you said was so nice and perfect, of like, yes, you are still a human being that's deserving of respect and another chance and hope and safety. And like, we will do everything we can to help you kind of get there. But it is such a complex issue. And so many victims of trafficking just get like swept under the rug because it's assumed that it's a choice, or it's assumed that it was, you know, oh, you're an adult and you know better type of thing, which is just so unfair, especially when you factor in any other past traumas, you know, that they might have gone through that, you know, led them to that point or have impacted their experiences. So I think that's super helpful, and I appreciate you saying all of that.
Yeah, no problem.
Yeah, that was awesome. And I think it, you know, it made me think too of like, just not judging someone. Like if you, you know, if you do speak up, if you do ask for help, like if you're somebody watching this episode, or you've seen in one of those, you know, bunch of documentaries and stuff, like making space for people to kind of disclose this stuff free from judgment, just knowing that they're so vulnerable already and they're choosing to reach out. Cara, I've been so reminded this whole episode of your frog in the water like metaphor.
Oh yeah.
Because it just all like builds up slowly and slowly and slowly over time. And Melissa, like you were saying, there's so many different resources and you don't know until you ask. Like this experience happens over time. So yeah, it might take a while for, you know, to get fully free from this different life that you've had, you know, been forced into living. But that doesn't mean that, you know, agencies like the Women's Center and others can't help you make a safety plan to make you feel this much safer, kind of one step at a time, if something is in fact going on.
I don't know if you can hear my cat scratching and banging against the door. She pretends like she wants to get out. She'll want to come back right in. So
She just wants to make you get your steps in. She wants to make you get up.
Yeah. Exactly right.
Oh
Which I definitely need, because I just, you know, COVID just here.
You're all right. We're all in the same boat. We're in this together.
Really hard.
Yeah.
We really are. We need the safe walk to come back around, so we all start walking.
Exactly.
I don't know. I don't know if that kind of felt like a good stopping point. Does anybody have any other like thoughts or anything else we want to add before we wrap up?
We probably could go on forever, because I was like, we haven't even really even touched upon like labor trafficking, because, you know, we talked much about like sex trafficking and under the umbrella of human trafficking. But I could go on forever.
Yeah.
We end all of our guest speaker episodes with like, we need a part 2. And like, just like, because you mentioned, you know, power and control. I feel like we talked about that, but not like super directly, because that's, you know, what's going on here too. So there is so much more we could expand on.
Yeah. And I guess that would be my like parting message for this episode. It was such a weird way to say that, I don't know. But would be that use this as your starting point. If you've never talked about this with friends before, if you've never thought about human trafficking other than the movie Taken or whatever maybe previous knowledge you had about the issue, like use this episode to take the initiative to learn more. Like we have, obviously we've mentioned a few times already, a ton of information on our social media, but like there's organizations like Love 146 and Polaris Project and Shared Hope International, Thorn, I mean, the list goes on and on and on, that have so many resources to try to educate the public. So that would definitely, I mean, we could easily talk about this forever, because it's such a huge issue and so complex and there's so many pieces to it. But I would definitely encourage our audience members that if hearing this episode made you think, I don't really know about that, or I've never heard that term before, go on and educate yourself, because it's super helpful, and you might spark conversations with friends or family that also have never heard about it before. So it's definitely, I know that when I started getting involved in the work of human trafficking, it was really hard to not like have it almost at the forefront, even within all the issues of domestic and sexual violence. It's so connected, and so, you know, not talked about. So I know that it's one of those things that once you see it, you can't unsee it, which is a good thing. We want to make it more visible. We want to make it, you know, so that people feel safer having access to resources, but also knowing that they're not alone and that they deserve help and safety. So yeah, I think this conversation is super important. And yeah, just that was all I wanted to add. And just thank you again, Melissa, for being here.
No problem. I appreciate you guys having me here, and if you guys do want a part two, I'm down. I'm game.
Yeah.
We
Awesome.
when we get talking
Yeah,
about
right.
stuff, just
No, it's awesome. It's great.
That's awesome. And I think, like, as always, we always like ask the audience for like your feedback. If you have thoughts, questions, comments, concerns, anything like that, feel free to reach out. We always put contact information in our caption. Also, we identified like a ton of different examples of like, this could be it or that could be it. And we talked about specific populations, like of, minority communities or the college population or whatever. If something triggered a thought and you think maybe you had an experience that feels like it might fit that, reach out. We can help, you process that, again, like free from judgment, free from like, well, this is what you're going to do and this is how you're going to get out of it. And, here's like 1, 2, 3, this, and then you're done. Like, if you just want to talk, like, we're here. The 24-hour hotline number is 203-731-5204. And then you can always reach out via email as well. And remember, we put these videos on Facebook and Instagram every Tuesday. And thank you, Melissa, and thank you for watching.
And thank you, Kitty, who made a little appearance.